Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Dora, and I am one of the organizers of Qesher, and you can also see here Sebastian. It's the two of us who started this initiative, and our aim is to introduce Jewish life, Jewish culture, Jewish history, Jewish heritage from all over the world via Zoom sessions. I know many of you have attended many of our previous talks. Usually we focus on a city or a country's Jewish heritage. And actually just recently we had a talk that is quite related to today's presentation about the Jews of Syria. You will see very soon how that's related. But today's event is part of another series, which we call the Qesher Book Club, in which authors speak about their books, which of course are also, as always, related to Jewish life around the world, Jewish history, Jewish culture. Today, we are very happy to welcome Zeeva Bukai, who is the author of The Anatomy of Exile, which was just published a few weeks ago. So it's fresh on the bookshelves, and hopefully some of you already had the chance to see it, and some of you will feel like reading it after this talk. We are very happy to have her here with us. She will present about her book, and after the presentation, of course, as always, we'll open it up for Q&A. So, Zeeva.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Dora and Sebastian, for inviting me to the Qesher Book Club. I'm really excited to be here and to have the opportunity to be able to talk about my book. I'm going to share a PowerPoint and kind of go through a little bit of my family history, the origins of the book. This is a work of fiction. It is an invention of my imagination, but as I think with most fiction, it is also rooted in a lot of history and family stories. So I'm going to share those with you today. Let's make sure that this comes up. Please let me know that, is this okay? Great. So this is my journey into the anatomy of exile, and I'm really looking at how history and my family stories inform this work of fiction. This is a photograph of Jaffa from Tel Aviv Beach. I'm going to talk about the origins of this story, the historical events that informed this novel, the family history that informed this novel as well, that worked its way into the narrative. I'm also going to talk about the Romeo and Juliet trope a little bit, because my book actually has three love stories. Two that are kind of like bookends that begin and end the book, and those are between Palestinians and Israelis. And one big one in the middle that is a marriage between an Ashkenazi and an Ashkenazi woman and a Mizrahi man. And then finally, I'd like to end kind of on a note of hope in what we can all see has been very much a time of despair since October 7th, 2023. So I began with what I knew, which was an intercultural marriage between a Mizrahi man and an Ashkenazi woman. This is a photograph of my parents, my father Shlomo Bukai, and my mother Rosa, or Shoshana in Hebrew, Yankelevich Bukai. She is 17 years old here. He is 26. Neither of my parents were born in Israel. My mother was actually born in Orsk on the border of Siberia at the start of the Second World War, and she spent most of the war in a children's home in a labor camp. Her family was either deported or escaped from Poland to Orsk. We could never really get the story straight. But we do know that my grandfather was in the Soviet army, and my grandmother was actually a laundress for the Soviet army. And she was basically left to raise two children in a foreign land on her own during the war. After the war, there was literally nothing left for them in their city in Krosznowitz, Poland, which is near Lodz. Their families were either, both my grandmother and my grandfather's families were killed either in Auschwitz or in Chelmno, and some died in the Lodz ghetto as well. When they returned to Poland, there was a Christian family that inhabited their home, and they could not go back into their house. The only place that they could get a visa was Israel, and so they immigrated to Israel when my mother was 9 years old. Now, my main character, Tamar, was a Sabra. She was born in Israel. And that was important for me to actually have a character that was born there because her husband is a Mizrahi. And I'll talk about my father a little bit, who is from Damascus, Syria, from Hadet El Yahud, which is the Jewish quarter in Damascus. He was born there in 1932. And a few years ago, my sister and brother actually did one of those DNA tests, and we found that we were 50% Ashkenazi, thanks to my mother, and 50% Mizrahi, thanks to my father. But what was interesting about the Mizrahi side is that not only was Syria a big part of that, but so was Lebanon, so was Jordan, so was Persia and Iraq. Persia being Iran today. And I always imagined, like in my fantasies, first of all, that my father's family, because they were from Damascus and because Damascene Jews were basically there for about 2,000 years. It's really one of those ancient Jewish communities. I had this fantasy that my family actually fled Jerusalem after the destruction of the Second Temple and made their way towards Syria, toward Damascus, basically crossing the Golan Heights to get there. And I also imagined, because we had that whole Persian thing going on in the DNA testing, I also imagined them as merchants going through the Silk Road, back and forth from Persia to Syria at least once every 2 or 3 years, or however long it would take them. My grandfather worked in the Haifa docks, even though the family lived in Damascus during the Ottoman Empire. This was actually before, I'm sorry, this is before the First World War. He would take a train from Damascus to Haifa, to work on the docks. He would stay there during the week, and then on Friday mornings, he would take the train back to Damascus. All of this completely fascinated me. This idea that Jews can travel from one country to the next in that region. This is something that we still can't do today, except maybe, I mean, since after the Yom Kippur War, Jews were able, once peace was created between Israel and Egypt, Jews were able to travel there. But at this time, all the way through up to like 1948, Jews were able to travel throughout the region. And I found that also especially fascinating. My grandfather, there's a story about him also hiding from the Turks, from the Ottoman Empire, when they would go around and conscript Jewish boys and Christian boys as well into the Ottoman army. The Christians were basically placed into the Ottoman army as janissaries, people who would guard. The Jews were actually put on the front lines and were often killed. So parents would hide their children would hide their sons from the Ottomans so that they wouldn't be conscripted. By the early 30s, my father's cousins were living in Haifa, and their best friends were their Arab neighbors. They literally lived like in the same buildings or side by side. They attended each other's marriages, funerals, celebrations, births, deaths. They were really close friends all the way up to 1948. As soon as Israel was established as a state, those relationships fell by the wayside and they were no longer viable. My father's cousins, as well as my father, fought in the War of Independence. My father was 17 at the time. In Syria, my father grew up in abject poverty. He was one of 10 children in the family. My grandmother actually married at the age of 14. I think my grandfather was either 15 or 16 years old. That's the way things were done back then. Neither of them were educated. My father was able to go to school until the age of 13, and really only because he, as many of his own contemporaries, went to the Alliance Française, which was a French school in Damascus. And I will speak about his journey into Israel in just a little bit. But I do want to say, to kind of keep in mind that both in the early 40s in Israel, the 70s through the 80s, the Ashkenazi Jews were the ones who basically were the ruling class. Even though the country was socialist, they were the ones who were in government. People like Ben Gurion and Levi Eshkol and Golda Meir were all Ashkenazi Jews. They were also the leaders in the army: Moshe Dayan, Arik Sharon, Shimon Peres, Rabin, all Ashkenazi Jews. Many came from Russia, Poland. The writers and poets of Israel at that time were also Ashkenazi, people like Bialik, Leah Goldberg, Natan Alterman, to name a few, as well as the mayor of Tel Aviv, whose name is Meir Dizengoff. I believe that unconsciously, my father and his two younger brothers, who came to Israel in 1945, understood that in order to be accepted into that society, they would need to marry Ashkenazi women. And what's really interesting is that all three of them did. I wanted to think about a few other things, kind of the economics of Israel at the time. My parents met when they both worked in Tasiyat Tzva'it. This was the military industries. My mother worked as a bookkeeper when she was 16. And when she met my father, he was working with Uziel Gal, who was the creator, or basically the designer, of the Uzi submachine gun. And so my father was actually testing Uzi and working alongside this man. Um, they also, in the 1950s, when they married, there was a tzena going on in Israel, basically austerity years. There were they rationed eggs. Uh, Actually, all foods were rationed. Housing was scarce, and yet there was a huge wave of immigration into Israel at that time from both post Holocaust Europe and the Mizrach, North Africa, as well as the Arab lands. And even though there was all of this austerity going on in Israel, the country managed to absorb all of these people. Um, there was a Kupat Cholim on every corner, in every neighborhood. No one worried about getting medical care. There was socialized medical care. The Histadrut, Israel's national trade union, oversaw the cultural, industrial, and economic institutions throughout Israel. And there was a building boom. And for me, Israel has always felt like it has been in a continuous building boom. When they arrived in Israel, my mother's family was placed in a ma'abara, which basically is a transit camp, which was near Yafo or Jaffa, and that transit camp actually burned down. My father and his brothers were placed on kibbutzim and moshavim, and I just want to say that I think at that time people had a real sense of purpose. You, they they felt like they were creating something, building something. And what they were creating was the Jewish state. They were creating a Jewish homeland. I look at, my parents in their youth, and I think about their history, the family's history. And these were the stories that I drew from. to create the novel. These were some of the threads that really stirred my imagination. Now, the novel has quite a few themes. The themes of war, alienation, exile, immigration, and loving the other, loving the person that is supposed to be your enemy. These themes permeate the novel, and they are part of the immigrant experience, whether the immigrants came to Israel or whether the immigrants left Israel and immigrated to the United States. This is a photo of my father as a young soldier after the 1956 war of attrition between Israel, France, Britain, and Egypt. This is after the War of 56 was after Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. This was actually, this photograph was taken by a professional photographer for a magazine in Israel at the time. I was interested, I think, first of all, war is a matter of fact in Israel. Every few years there's one. Some of them have been devastating, like this past one. Others were quick. We'll talk about the Six-Day War. But Israel literally was born into war. As terrible as that sounds, when we think of, May 14th, we think of Israeli independence, and at that moment, there is a war, right? Immediately, Israel is thrown into war. And so I feel that it's a part of the national psyche, and it was something that I really wanted to understand. I wanted to know how that war of independence, what that felt like to people, how the war of 67 felt, how the war of 73 felt. The book is actually, the timeline of the book is from 1967 to 73. And I chose those two wars because they were seminal moments in Israeli history. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. I also wanted to take a look at and see what happens to a family when a father or a brother or an uncle, a cousin goes to war. What happens to the children left behind? What happens to the marriage of those people? In the novel, I look at what the death of a beloved sister does to a family, to the marriage between Tamar and Salim. Everyone thinks that Hadass has died in a terror attack until Tamar, the main character, learns the truth. And it becomes a catalyst that drives the narrative forward. War, violence, hate, its opposite, peace and love, are also explored in the novel. What do we choose? Do we choose love or hate? Why do we choose it? These were some of the questions that I asked myself. The longer I worked on the novel, the more I realized that we were at the mercy of outside forces. Societal, cultural, and religious forces can sometimes create this sense of violence and hatred. And I also realized that we're tribal people. The Middle East is all about tribes, and for good reason. It's the thing that kept them alive. Community was important. That community teaches us a belief system, and we use that belief system in our dealings with our friends and with our enemies. But when we leave the tribe, what happens? When we become alienated, how does that change our thinking? In the book, I thought about immigration a lot. The idea of creating a better life for yourself and for your children. For my parents, it was easier for them to get a visa to the US in 1961 and to have a sponsor. But I also think that for many cultures, immigration at that time in the 60s and 70s was easier for men in a way because women were expected to stay home. Men were the ones who were out in the workforce. They were the ones who were dealing with America, and so were the children in schools. And many times, women were left in the home feeling isolated and alienated from their spiritual home, from the place that they came from. And so I think I use Tamar as a way to explore that sense of isolation, that sense of that sense of alienation, that in itself creates this huge longing for home. The longing for home, again, is something that absolutely permeates this narrative. So in the Aliyat Ha'elif, which is called the Operation 1000 Children, this was something that my father, his sister, and his two brothers were a part of. The Aliyat Ha'elif was a program that tried to get over 1,000 children from Syria, many of them from Damascus, into Israel to basically smuggle them there, to give them a better life. I recently listened to a YouTube video of a lecture on this specific thing, on the Aliyat Ha'elif. And one of the things that was really made clear to me was how Zionist the Damascus Jewish the Damascus Jewish community was. They grew up basically almost speaking Hebrew. They studied Hebrew in school. They studied the prayers. They knew all the piyutim. They were also involved in youth movements, right? Like Maccabi and Habonim, and all of those youth movements were actually there teaching teaching Jewish children, just the way they were in Europe, teaching Jewish children about their culture and about Israel as well. I think that Syrian Jews were avid Zionists because of those youth movements, but also because of their proximity to Israel. There it was, the place that they prayed to. There was Jerusalem. There was their history. And also, again, because they knew Hebrew, because they knew the prayers, but they also lived under Ottoman rule and later under Arab rule, under Syrian rule, and for a brief time under French and British rule. But when they were living under Ottoman rule, they were dhimmis. They were basically second-class citizens. And so I really think that this was another thing. This gave them a sense of their own power, a sense of identity that they couldn't necessarily cultivate, at least this aspect of their Jewish identity in their community at the time. They After the First World War, there was a group of young Syrian Jews that made Aliyah to Israel. They basically snuck in. And they went and they lived on Tel Yosef, a kibbutz in the northern Jezreel Valley, Emek Israel. And they would become an integral part of the Aliyat Ha'elif program. This group of young Syrians, along with the help of the Jewish Agency and the Jewish British Brigade working out of Damascus, established the Aliyat Ha'elif, and between the 1930s and 40s, 1,300 Syrian Jewish children, most if not all from Damascus, from the Jewish quarter, was smuggled across the Golan Heights. And many of them, like my uncles Yossi and Ezra, who were 8 and 11, respectively, were placed on Tel Yosef, and my father was actually placed 10 miles away from them on a moshav called Moshav Balforia. Every Friday, my dad would travel to Kibbutz Tel Yosef to spend Shabbat with his young brothers. If he missed the bus, he would hitchhike, and if he couldn't find a ride, he would walk. In Balforia, he lived with a Czech couple whose only languages were Czech and Yiddish. And my father, who was an Arab speaker and who could speak Hebrew, had to learn Yiddish in order to be able to survive there. So he was fluent in Yiddish. To keep track of the children who crossed the border was a man by the name of Menachem Luzia, and he kept a notebook where he entered the names, ages, date of arrival, paternity, and destination of all the children who were part of this smuggling operation. It's one of the few pieces of evidence that's left that speaks to this particular history. And my father and his two young brothers arrived in Palestine on June 6th, 1945. And I know this because it's written in Luzia's notebook. And my father passed away in 2005. And I found this material much later. And I cannot tell you the feeling that I had seeing my father's name there in that notebook. It was quite a moving experience. I think what's also really interesting about this history is that it wasn't only boys who were smuggled into Palestine, but girls as well, which is unusual for young women in that region, to be allowed that kind of freedom and independence before marriage. And yet many girls did cross, including my Aunt Leah, who's also known as Lulu, and she was the first in my father's family to be sent there. Um, my grandmother Esther believed that Lulu would find a better life for herself, and it must have been completely terrifying for her to send her children so far away. But she did it, and it would take 40 years before she would see them all again. There were consequences to my grandparents sending their children from Damascus to Syria in the Aliyata Elif. My grandmother was imprisoned twice. My grandfather was in and out of prison because of it. My grandmother was beaten. She was beaten with bamboo sticks on the bottom of her feet until they were swollen and bleeding, until she could barely walk. There was police harassment continuously. Um, and it was, I imagine that it was that she felt it was worth it to get them out of Damascus, because after 48 things got much worse for the Jewish community. So this is my uncle Sammy when he was probably about 16 years old. He was, of course, my father's younger brother, and the Al-Menashe synagogue bombing was a famous synagogue in Damascus, in Haret El Yahud, the Jewish quarter. And one Friday night in August 5th, 1949, three youths who were against the peace talks at this point going on between Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Israel after the War of Independence, threw two grenades into the Al-Menashe synagogue while it was full of congregants. 12 people were killed. Eight of them were children. 30 people were wounded. My uncle Sammy, along with my grandfather, were in that synagogue. Sammy was 5 years old, and he lost an eye. Um, in the interview that was featured a few weeks ago, my uncle Sammy was in that particular talk about Syrian Jews. He basically stated that the people that he was most afraid of at this time were the Palestinians who had left Palestine and had made their way to Syria and were living there. Let's see. Are we? So this is a photograph from Avi Shavit's My Promised Land, that book, My Promised Land. And it's a photograph of Lod, of Lida, in 1948, when this Arab community left Lud. This is how I imagine the abandoning, which is, by the way, the title of the first chapter of my book. This is how I imagine the abandoning of the Arab village that I create in my book called Kfar Ma'an, which is based on a real Arab village by the name of Sheikh Munis. That village has been completely wiped out, and it is now Tel Aviv University and Ramat Aviv. So in Sheikh Munis, so my family has a whole history with Sheikh Munis, and I will show you the next slide. So this is the greenhouse. The greenhouse was actually a very prominent sheikh's house. After Sheikh Munis was abandoned by the Arab community there, there is a whole history about Sheikh Munis. In March of 1948, the Irgun actually laid siege to Sheikh Munis. They surrounded it. The Arab villagers were not allowed out for about 2 weeks. they got very, very frightened, and without a shot being fired, they abandoned the village. They abandoned Sheikh Munis. After the War of Independence, there were 200 Mizrahi families who were now placed on Sheikh Munis. My father, my Aunt Leah and her husband, my cousin was born there, her first child, all lived in Sheikh Munis. And I remember when I went to Tel Aviv University, my father actually said, "Oh, I know that place. That's Sheikh Munis," and began telling me stories about the apartment that he lived in, which was a small little studio. In this particular place, the greenhouse, which is now well, it's called the greenhouse now. It is on Tel Aviv University, and it is where celebrations are held. It's where faculty celebrations are held. Um, I wanted to I wanted to bring in this particular place because I think that it meant a lot to both of my parents. They lived there when they first got married. And I've also wanted to, this also raises the question about what is home? Where is it? How do we create it? Is it where our grandparents lived, or is it where we live now? Is it both of those things? So those questions, this idea of home permeates the novel all the time. As I said, I placed this novel between the 67 war and the 73 war. And I really feel that there was an element of existential dread. And this war was existential dread to victory within a matter of 6 days. Before the war, there were actually rabbis who were sanctifying parklands because they were that frightened that there would be so many dead that there wouldn't be enough room in cemeteries. The government speeded up or beefed up production of coffins for fear that there would be so many dead that we would need to have more coffins. There were trenches built. They were literally digging trenches around Tel Aviv for fear that the Egyptian army would come to Tel Aviv. So there really was a feeling of existential dread. And every night, Radio Cairo would talk about how they were going to annihilate the Jews. So Israel was quite frightened at the time. And of course, as you know, the war starts on June 5th, ends the 10th. Israel goes to war with Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. And 6 days later, the entire world changes, right? Israel now has East Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Desert. The next part of my book is actually the family in America. And this is a photograph of my parents, my mother, my father, and myself at Coney Island. And here I really wanted to discuss the idea of American culture and how, when you come to America, how do you maintain your Jewish identity? My family were completely secular. We were not part of a synagogue or necessarily a Jewish community. What we did have was my grandmother's community. All of, and most of them were Holocaust survivors. Um, but we also very much maintained our Israeli identity. How do you maintain a family life in a new place when suddenly your children are speaking a language that is different from yours? How do you maintain work life? My father worked 2 or 3 jobs. He worked nights in a factory for many, many years. He worked weekends as a security guard. He did everything that he possibly could in order to maintain family, to basically make enough money for us to live. So how do you maintain a family life under those circumstances? And as I said, what bookends the novel is the Yom Kippur War. It starts in 67, it basically ends in 73. And here we have terrible, terrible losses in Israel. 2,600 soldiers are killed, which was more than any other war. They are caught by surprise, which was devastating, and of course has reverberations for us today because of what happened on October 7th. During the Yom Kippur War, my husband was in a tank cleanup unit, and there were so many bodies of Egyptian soldiers that were left behind that were then buried in mass graves in the Sinai Desert. But what did come out of this was peace with Egypt in 1979, a peace that still holds until today. We might not be friends, but we're also not at war. And this kind of takes us a little further away. I'm going to segue into this idea of the Romeo and Juliet trope and why it is still so prevalent today. I think, as I said, there are two kind of Romeo, well, really three Romeo and Juliet love stories in the book. The Mizrahi Ashkenazi one, with two very different cultures coming together. And of course, the two love stories that bookend the novel between a Palestinian man at the beginning, Daoud, and Hadass, a Syrian Jewish woman who comes to Israel on the Aliyat Ha'elef program. And then at the end, Tamar's daughter, Ruby, and a young Palestinian boy named Faisal. So I think that the reason this trope is so prevalent and that we still see today in things like West Side Story and all sorts of other, other novels and other novels, films, plays, all sorts of things. And I think it's because it speaks to our youth. It speaks to this idea of purity of heart, the idea that love conquers all, which frankly, unfortunately, I don't quite believe. I believe compassion and empathy can conquer all, but love, sometimes not so much. And there's also this feeling, and I think that this is really what brings the Romeo and Juliet trope so alive, is this feeling that it is us against the world. So I'm going to take just a few minutes to read a very short section of the novel, if that's okay. Do we still have enough time? Yeah? Okay. Tel Aviv, 1968. I'm reading from the beginning, from the start of the novel. They were on the beach when they heard the news of Hadassah's death. It came over the transistor radio, her name cut through the surf and salted air that swelled with the gleeful cries of children and ice cream vendors hawking their wares. Salim sank to his knees as the lifeguard's whistle cautioned swimmers to stay close to shore. Tamar drew circles of comfort on her husband's shoulders and whispered that it couldn't be his sister who'd been killed on the bus from Haifa to Tel Aviv. In a daze, they gathered their things, her feet burning as she stumbled after him. They ran past the water spigot and outdoor showers, stopped to slip on their sandals, and lost their towels along the way. They crossed against the light on Ben Yehuda Street. Cars stopped, drivers cursed and shook their fists at them. They charged through the afternoon heat, their breath loud in their ears. Salim was the first to reach their apartment on Frug Street. Tamar was close behind. He tried inserting the key into the lock, but it fell from his hands. She bent to retrieve it and fought the urge to glide her hands up over his body, if only to remind him that they were alive. She opened the door and he staggered ahead. The rooms were dim, light bending through the closed jalousies. They didn't speak. They didn't strip out of their damp bathing suits or comb their matted hair. He thrust his legs into a pair of trousers and set off for the police station. She watched him from the balcony, his figure receding, and wanted to call him back, afraid he'd disappear like Hadass. When he was gone, she sought the strip of horizon between the Bauhaus buildings, the fresh scar that separated blue sky from bluer sea, then cupped her hands over her ears and imagined waves tumbling onto the shore. She felt the weight of water, the motion of current, its rhythm a steady pulse. She saw Selim as he was that afternoon, powerful, sturdy, as she wrapped her legs around his hips, his feet buried in silt, their kisses a gentle bumping of teeth and salty tongues, their swim graceful as two seals, their laughter palpating the sky. She tried to recapture the moment before he adjusted the radio dial, and then the beep signaling the hourly news, curdling the day like a spoon of vinegar in a cup of milk. My final slide here is we cannot heal a bleeding wound with a big stick. This is a quote by Amos Oz in his last lecture at Tel Aviv University before he died. I wanted to leave us all kind of with a sense of hope in a time of despair, to talk about the novel in the aftermath of October 7th and what I hope readers can come away with. I hope they come away with a sense of hope, with a possibility of coexistence, with a possibility of some kind of reconciliation, a pathway to peace. I hope that is something that we can do. I think that my novel does talk about a possible way forward, and that is through empathy and compassion. Tamar learns very much to kind of let go of fear and embrace empathy and love. And here are a few resources for peace. I think that, Dora, I don't know if you want to, how people can kind of get this if they're interested in looking at some of these sites. The Jerusalem Youth Chorus, by the way, for anyone who is interested, is absolutely beautiful. It is a chorus of young Israelis and Arabs in Jerusalem, in Israel, basically, who come together to sing, and it's really heartening to watch them. And that is basically it. I'm going to stop sharing right now. I hope that this didn't feel too long. I see I went 4 minutes over. I'm sorry. There was kind of a lot of information to go through, and I tried to do it as quickly as possible.
No problem at all. And thank you so much for sharing so much of your story and so much of what the book is about. I think it's amazing how you weave so many different topics and really heavy and even taboo themes
Yes.
so nicely into a story. And I just, when we had a discussion just with you, and you told us that writing this book for you was the way to overcome all the heaviness that Israel has and all these
Yes.
terrible moments. And I think that that's just a beautiful phrase about what really this book is about. So I just wanted to share that with everyone. So thank you, Zeeva, and thank you everyone for being here. And of course, now we will open it up for questions. And there were a few questions about the recording. We will send it out tomorrow. And we are also happy to send out the links that Zeeva just shared. And of course, also her website where you can find the book. There was a question if there will be an audio version of your book.
Yes, there will be an audio version of the book. It'll probably be out in a few months. My agent, I'm not quite sure what happened there, but the audio rights were sold. The actress who is recording is actually, her mother is Israeli, so she really has a wonderful handle. Her name is Gili, and she has a wonderful handle on both the Israeli accent and the Arab accent, and just she really understands the book. So I'm very pleased with that. And I was able to, that they sent me a taping of hers, and I was able to actually say, yes, that's who I want to read my book. So I'm hoping that it all works out.
Great. And will there be a discussion guide, or is there
Yes.
already?
So I'm actually creating a discussion guide. I'm going to put my, should I put my website into the chat? I can put my
You
website in
can
the
also put
chat,
your
or you,
website in the chat, and we will
yeah.
also send it
Okay.
out tomorrow.
So in the next few weeks, probably closer to March, I will have a reader's guide in. I really feel like I need a reader's guide for this. And there will be one on my website. So I'm working on that with my editor now to get
Thank
that
you.
going. So it will be there.
And will you consider a screenplay in the future?
If there's anybody out there who wants to do the screenplays, yes, I'd love it. But I personally am not going to be writing the screenplay at this point. I think that should be for somebody else. Although, I mean, that would be a wonderful fantasy. You know, I can see it. I can see this as a Netflix series, just putting it out there.
Thank you. Gianpaolo, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for your very nice presentation. I look forward to receiving your book here to Europe.
Oh, I would love that. My agent is actually trying to sell the rights to Europe. I don't know how that's going to work. I think that getting a book like this, an Israel, a book about Israel, is a little difficult right now.
I have a little question. I'm a bit intrigued. When I read the family name Abadi, I was quite amazed. Well, actually, I'm remotely connected with the large Abadi family from Aleppo.
Oh,
And
really?
what made you choose this particular family name?
I used to work at Flatbush Yeshiva High School, where there was a large Syrian community. And that was one of, that was one of the names that I heard. There were many. There was Sassoon, there was Abadi, there were Mamrud. My grandmother's name was Mamrud. I thought about using that, but then I really decided that I wanted a name that had nothing to do with my family, and so I chose Abadi. But I'd love to hear your story about the Abadi family in Aleppo. So yeah.
And I think just to add to the Europe, that it's available on Kindle, right? So
it is available in Kindle, and for those of you in England, it is distributed. It is distributed in the UK. So if you order it from your bookstore, if there's anybody here from the UK, if you order it at your bookstore, you can get it there if you want a hard copy. And yes, it is definitely available on Kindle.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gianpaolo.
Thank you. And if there are any more questions, please feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat, and I'll be happy to read it out. In the meantime, I'll throw in a question. I thought it was very interesting when you spoke about your father, how he was an Arabic speaker and a Hebrew speaker, and then he arrived to Israel and had an Ashkenazi majority and even had to learn Yiddish from his neighbors. And I started wondering about the identity and how that identity also created these love stories between Jews and Palestinians, that in a sense, could it be that perhaps an Arab identity was just as important as the Jewish identity, and in some way you wanted to show this relationship, or what's your opinion about
Absolutely. So
this part?
I think very much like the Hadass and Dawood love story, which is the one at the beginning, right? This is Hadass is Tamar's husband's sister. So this is her sister-in-law. What I really felt was that in some way that Arab identity, that Palestinian/Arab identity must have felt very close to the Arab Jews who were in Israel, right? It was the same language, culturally, the food was the same, the music was the same. There's this kind of primal, because of the language, kind of this primal essence that they must have felt very connected to. That was my thinking in creating these stories. And not only that, but also the sense that we're, when we come to the later love story, kind of the later Romeo and Juliet love story, there's this sense of both of us are foreigners here. And so even though one of them was born there, there is this, we're culturally different than everybody else. And so that brings us together. So yes, I completely agree with you. That is something that I was very interested in, and thinking that this must be what happened, And I also imagine that there must have been many relationships between Arabs and Jews. I mean, there was one in my family that one of these days I'm going to write about, so I'm not going to give that story away, but where even in Damascus, there were Jews who had who might have had relationships with people outside of their community, the Muslims or Christians. And I mean, their families probably sat Shiva for them, but it did happen. These things did occur.
Thank you. When will it be in paperback and in libraries?
So I think paperback probably comes out in about another, I would imagine another year, probably this time next year they'll be out. And in libraries, if you go to your local library, you can actually ask them to order it. It's on, there are libraries that have it, and I know libraries, people who've asked their libraries to order it. And people have asked their libraries to order it for book clubs. I didn't really know that was a thing, but it is. You can, if you're part of a book club, by the way, if you are part of a book club and you'd like me to speak, I'd be happy to do that. And you can also ask your local library to order a certain amount for you for a book club, or just one copy.
Thank you. The next question is, were your parents alive on October 7th? You mentioned that your father had passed away.
My mother passed away. My mother passed away in 1983. I was quite young when she passed away, and my father in 2005. But no, I think that they would have been horrified. They would have been. I mean, just like the rest of us, they would have been absolutely horrified by what had happened. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to read out the question. I was going to ask if you see the Mizrahi community as a source of helpful insights as Israelis deal with bridging relations with Palestinians and Jews. What is your impression of how that does not seem to work in political alliances?
So I think from Israel, there's like two answers to that. The first is, I think for Mizrahi communities, having grown, especially the ones who have grown up amongst their Arab neighbors, it's really interesting. They kind of, it feels to me, and from everything that I've heard kind of from my Mizrahi family and everything else, that they hold two truths. One, that face to face, they could be friends. They could, as I said, they can go to each other's weddings. They can commiserate when somebody dies in the family. And yet, at the same time, they will still hold the other truth that this person is my enemy. This person hates me, right? And so I think that Mizrahi Jews, in many ways, had more difficulty with the Arab community in Israel, in many ways, on some level. Again, on another level, I have an uncle who was a butcher for years and would go to the West Bank in order to buy meat, right? To go buy an entire sheep and take it back to his butcher shop in Holon. And so I think it's such a hard call, because so much of this, in terms of the Mizrahi community, they lived amongst their Arab neighbors for thousands of years, right? And there were times that were very difficult and other times where things were okay. I think that the Mizrahi community has given Israelis insights into how to deal with Palestinians. Some of those insights aren't necessarily positive ones. And I think right now the political situation is so fraught that it's difficult for us to see a way forward. Yes, Naomi, they lived as dhimmis in the Arab world. They were always second-class citizens, and so they never quite felt connected. They were never really allowed to feel fully connected, even though I think that there were Jewish, Mizrahi communities all along the Arab world who really loved their homes, that they felt they felt connected to Iraq. They felt connected to Morocco. They felt connected to Syria. I don't know if I've answered that question. I'm not sure that I can, really.
I see Rachel nodding, so I hope yes.
Yeah.
And the next question is, I'm curious about your take on the Romeo and Juliet relationship, as while it is a story about differences aligning in love, it is also a story that had tragic consequences.
Yeah, exactly. I think that, so the first, I'm not giving anything away in the book. The first Romeo and Juliet love story in my novel, the first page, Hadassah's death, we learn later on that this is a love story that has a tragic ending. I think part of the illicitness, the taboo-ness of these Romeo and Juliet stories is part of what makes them exciting, and it is part of what makes them so, it's not just exciting, but absorbing, and this sense that you are overcome by this love, right? And whether it ends in tragedy or not, they are living in the moment, and the moment is so seductive that they can't see beyond it.
Thank you.
Between Jewish community and other parts.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's a comment
Yeah.
that this was also in Europe,
Yeah.
the relationship with the non-Jewish neighbors.
Exactly.
Melanie, go
Hi.
ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to focus on the immigrant experience because I am one too, came from South Africa, and I've lived in the United States for many years. But what is particularly interesting is the foreignness of the Jewish community that I found in the United States. Coming from South Africa, I think maybe because there was always a threat, but there was a whole class of people, the majority of the population, had far more discrimination than we ever felt. And I never felt any anti-Semitism. Now, unfortunately, it is completely different. But I honestly was astounded about the assimilation of Jews in the United States, maybe because we had to keep a close-knit community, I'm not sure. But it took me a long time to adjust to that. I had not anticipated being that way. And I came speaking the language. I had the right papers. I flew in. I didn't have to be smuggled. So I couldn't have come in a better way. And yet it was and my husband disappeared into a medical residency. So my nearest relative was across country on the West Coast. We were on the East Coast. So I can understand the trauma. And now, of course, I'm just so thrilled to be here. But I do think that, I can only imagine what your family must have gone through sneaking and, smuggling themselves across the border, considering what I did. And I had everything going for me. And I just want to emphasize that because I'm not sure that the other people on this video can totally appreciate what it's like to change countries.
Yeah. So I came here with my parents in 1961. My grandmother was already here and she was able to sponsor us. I think that for my father being smuggled in, and also for my mother going to Israel after the war and really being homeless. She grew up in basically in an orphanage. She saw her mother on Sundays. And then to be taken out of that and back to Poland and trying to find their way there. And then from there to go to Israel. So there was always this peripatetic sense of not being able to find a place where you can drop roots. I think was very much a part of most especially her experience. For my father, interestingly enough, I think both in terms of like terrain, he knew some Hebrew coming into Israel. He was separated from his brothers. I don't know why they did that. I don't know why they didn't keep them all together. I think it's terrible that they didn't. And as I said, every Friday he went to Tel Yosef to be with his younger brothers because, and his sister. He had nothing else. He was literally separated from them. So I think that alienation really speaks to the immigrant experience. When I was writing Tamar, who is the main character here, this sense of, you were saying that your husband was in a medical residency, and I immediately kind of thought of Tamar, whose husband is working all the time, whose children are in school, and she is left within the four walls of the apartment trying to make friends with the neighbors who were nothing like her. Her best friend is a Greek woman, also an immigrant. So, she reaches out to somebody who is something like her. Her terrain is a few blocks. She's never even been to Manhattan. And she's been in America for a few years. And so, or she has been only as far as Manhattan and not further than that. So the sense of isolation, I think, for immigrants is something that we don't quite get, unless they're part of a community. Like there is a Syrian community here. My parents were never part of it. My father was married to an Ashkenazi woman, and he was not accepted into the Syrian community because of that. So, yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, no.
The way I can describe it is, I think for 3 years, I felt I was swimming upstream against the current. Slowly but surely, I managed to get with it. But everything is different. Everything looks different. The post boxes, the buses,
Everything.
Everything. There's nothing familiar.
Yeah.
And so it's, I think it can be, if you go straight to work, like my husband did, it was difficult for him too, because, he also had to adjust. But, just to emphasize the immigrant experience, even when you have everything going for you, it's not that easy.
Thank you so much, Melanie.
Thank you very much, Melanie. And we'll read 2 more questions. One, Kitty, you can ask, and then I'll read one more question from the chat before closing.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, Zeeva, thank you so much for a really wide-ranging and really informative presentation. And thank you for the book itself, which I have read and which is so wonderful. I really recommend it to everyone. I have a question that might be a little bit indiscreet, but the main love story, unlike the other two, the main love story is a mixed marriage between an Ashkenazi woman and a Mizrahi man, which, as you've told us today, is something that you're intimately close to. So here's my question. I mean, yes, the Sephardic and Mizrahi stories were really marginalized until very recently, in this Ashkenormative, as it's now called, approach. And so it's wonderful that these stories are coming to us and are being voiced and are being spoken. But something that, I mean, in your novel, Tamar is presented as very lonely, even, before she meets her husband. And his sister, who, her friend. And the Mizrahi family and culture by implication is presented as somehow warmer and with greater vitality than the Ashkenazi. And so I guess my first question is whether you did that deliberately. I mean, it certainly felt like something that I picked up in the novel. And I also wonder whether there isn't now, this is the controversial part of my question, almost a kind of Orientalism in our fascination with the Mizrahi experience. And I mean, I share it, you know, I'm Ashkenazi, and especially with the weight of the Holocaust that many of us carry, you know, there is a kind of appeal of the, you know, the Mediterranean and the Middle Eastern and et cetera, and, you know, we won't even talk about the food, which, you know, I mean, hands down, no,
I know.
so, you know, there's no contest. But anyway, I just wanted to raise that question, and especially that question of, I mean, is the pendulum swinging to the other side? Is there a kind of romanticization now of the Sephardic and Mizrahi cultures?
So I think, you know, my daughter lived in Israel for about 6 or 7 years. And what was interesting is that she got very friendly with a group of Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews in Israel, all of whom were poets and were now calling themselves Arab Jews, right? No longer Mizrahi Jews, but actually calling them Aravim Israelim, right? And Arab or Aravim Yehudim, right? Arab Jews. And so I think that in Israel, at least at that time, honestly, after October 7th, I really feel that there's such a, you know, rupture in the whole society now. But before then, there was this kind of turning back to who they were, where they came from. And this was not them. They were not born in those countries, but their parents were. And their first languages, many of them, some of them were Ladinos, some of them were, you know, was Arabic. For many of them was Arabic. And they were now sort of threading that aspect of their lives into their poetry. And she went to, you know, she went to many poetry readings and sent me a couple of books, and, you know, by these young Israeli poets. So I think there, I wouldn't necessarily call it a fascination or an Orientalism, but a kind of rededication and a re-exploration or another exploration of this aspect of their identity, which for many years was, you know, suppressed in a way. You know, Israel was all about, look, even though my father was with a Czech family in, you know, from 45 until, I don't know when, until he got old enough to be able to leave and join the Palmach or whatever he did. Even then, you know, Israel was all about getting rid of the shtetl, getting rid of, you know, who you were. You are now building a new identity. So I think that the Mizrahi identity, because it was suppressed for so long, right? Because, you know, the Ashkenazi identity was the one that was really elevated, that there is this kind of resurgence, this interest in Mizrahi culture, for sure. And also, I think, because it has been, you know, because everyone is always talking about the Palestinian, you know, the Nakba and their diaspora and everything else, no one talks about the Mizrahi, you know, the Mizrahi catastrophe of where you have, you know, 800,000 Mizrahi Jews from Arab lands who were essentially forced to leave. So I think in that way, there is this exploration, and rightly so, you know, that they're looking at their own identities, where their families came from.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kitty.
And I'll read this last question. One of the greatest achievements of this book is the level of compassion and empathy Zeeva breathes into each of her characters, visible and invisible. How do you achieve this?
Oh, it took so long. It took me 10 years to write this novel, and it was a real growth experience for me. I really felt like I grew with Tamar. But thank you, Naomi. Thank you so much for that. I tried as hard as I could to write a balanced, nuanced novel about people of different countries who are supposed to be enemies and who hopefully can learn to live with each other, you know, if not love each other. But I think, and also, you know, I had a Palestinian sensitivity reader for this book. I felt it was really important for me to get a viewpoint of, you know, the other side, right? To see if I was doing a decent job, a good enough job of being balanced, of showing people as they were, of not creating heroes and villains. And she was incredible. It was painful. I had to look at my own bias, you know, like biases that I didn't even know were there. And I had to address them. And I hope I did that in the novel. That was, you know, my goal was to make it as I said, as balanced and as human as possible.
Thank you so much, Zeeva. Thank you. I think this is
so
a
much.
wonderful question to close with. Thank you, everyone, for being here, for your curiosity and questions and participation. We really appreciate it. And we'll send out all the information tomorrow. And we have 2 more events this week. On Thursday, you can learn about the Jews of Colombia. And on Sunday, we'll have an event about the Jews of Afghanistan. So another interesting topics to learn about. We hope you can join us then. We'll also send out information with our upcoming events. So thank you very, very much, everyone. And I'll just pass back for a closing word to Zeeva.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm so thrilled, and I'm really touched that you're all here and that we're talking about this book, which has meant so much to me. And thank you. I'm going to put my. Are you going to give people my website so that they can?
Yes.
Yeah. So all the information that you might need is on my website. Oh my
I just
God.
want to read out one more comment. I just
Yeah.
found you saw it. Okay.
I see that.
I'll
that
let
I
you
was,
react to it.
that I was the English teacher for one of the daughters here, Ariane. Is that Arlene? Arlene Luzon? Yeah. Luzon. Yeah. Wow, that's wonderful. Chloe, I don't remember. I'm so sorry. I wish I did. It was quite a while ago, and I've had many, many students since then. But please give her my best regards, my warmest regards. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dora, and thank you, Sebastian, for this opportunity. I think what you are doing here is so incredible and so important. Thank you.
Thank you, Zeeva, and thank you, everyone. And we wish you a wonderful rest of the day or good night.
Okay, thank you.
Bye. Bye, everyone.